Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so in this video, I'd like to talk a little bit more about JODI Hildebrandt. Okay, I've watched a few more videos of her. I've watched some videos from her private Facebook page or whatever, where she and Ruby were, just talking more and more about their idea of, truth versus distortion and sort of like the clash and battle of ideas in the world. And the more I look at her, the more I come very close to thinking that she's either has diagnosable narcissistic personality disorder, or she has been raised in such a way and she's assimilated the doctrines of her Mormonism in such a way that it's almost indistinguishable from having a personality disorder. Okay, so basically, the thing I want to talk about is something I've seen over and over again as I watch JODI Hildebrandt, which is her notion of conflict. Okay. And I think the way she senses and her sense of what conflict is, okay, her vision of conflict, I think, to me is very similar to what I've seen in a lot of people who have either cluster B disorders or specifically narcissism. Okay. When I look at narcissism, basically I'm looking at fundamentally below all the arrogance and below all the just the lack of regard for other people and all that. What I really see in narcissism, I see a very selective processing of information, basically, where, at the end of the day, like a lot of people, narcissists have their sort of preferred way of looking at the world, their preferred way of looking at their self. Okay, their preferred way of looking at themselves in relation to the world. Okay, and they sort of develop sort of a vision of the world that's very, very sort of loaded towards their preferences of how they see themselves and the world. And also too, I think there's something about, like, say, the stress of processing a lot of information from outside, let's say your tight circle of interest, let's say your own personal affairs and maybe a few people around you, and you really diminish the fidelity and reality of things that are outside that tight circle. Okay, and that may just be in part because of just the tediousness and the just the bandwidth, the loading of it, the processing, like, say, the processing load of having to deal with a bunch of information coming from the outside. It just kind of adds to the processing workload, basically. And I think if you're very irritable and you don't have a lot of tolerance for a lot of competing, chaotic, sort of dissonant, incompatible information, it's almost it's almost easier just to process information that's close to you, and also information that's sort of harmonious with your preferences. Okay, so it's kind of complicated, but it's basically just, kind of reducing the processing workload, and, sort of reducing that frustration and that irritation of having to deal with a lot of chaotic, incompatible ideas, and just kind of overloading the workload, basically. It's just, I think at the machine level, at the level of machine language, I think it does have to do with our preference for a simpler processing workload. And that because we tend to prefer things that are, in line with our preferred way of thinking and also close to our tight circle of interest, that it will eventually develop into a very notable selfishness, a very notable egotism. But when you look at, let's say, how we filter information, like, say, I have my preferred information, I've got my preferred orbit of information, scope of information. I like to keep it kind of in a tight circle around my own personal interests. And you sort of get habituated to that. Okay. But what is it in the psychology that sort of pushes away or blocks information that's, say, outside your personal interests, or outside your, let's say, your orbit, or your set of preferred ways of looking at the world? Okay, how do we sort of block and screen out, opposing or conflicting or incompatible subject matter? Okay, and I think basically we do that by, over time, developing sort of walls, and sort of attitudes, and sort of attitudes that sort of push away subject matter that's not really, let's say, to our preference. All right. And over time and over time and over time, through a combination of attitude and sort of wall building, psychological wall building, we sort of develop sort of a dynamic, okay, in our psychology of how we approach things that are not, let's say, compatible with our preferences, or things that are, let's say, inconsistent with our preferences or in conflict with our preferences. Okay. So basically, we're looking at, how do we process dissonant, and how do we face and process dissonant and conflicting subject matter? dissonant subject matter, incompatible subject matter, basically. And that's kind of like the very bottom level of, I think, the narcissistic psychology. All right. So that in the end, what we're doing is we're developing sort of a dynamic where we're setting up barriers with an attitude, okay, to prevent information coming in that's going to kind of weigh on us in a very uncomfortable, unfamiliar way. Okay. And so basically you develop sort of a dynamic where in the world of conflict, in the world of incompatible subject matter, you sort of have sort of a clashing or a sort of very, very barrier oriented sort of separation between information that, say, is compatible with your preferences, or interesting, or let's say of interest to your tight orbit of interest, or information that's kind of outside your preferred scope of interest, or just incompatible with your preferences. All right. So basically, the psychology is one of sort of a clashing, as opposed to it's more like clashing than it is like reconciliation. Okay, reconciliation is where you bring in matter that you don't necessarily agree with, and you may never agree with, but you bring it in to sort of let it sit together and sort of develop perspective around it. Okay, so at the very least, you can have more understanding around it and more familiarity, even if you never agree with it. You know what I mean? So just because you have reconciliation in your heart, that doesn't mean you come to agree things that are outside, let's say, your preferences, but you do come to sort of bring them into your world. So at least you have perspective and understanding. All right. So you can almost say that the more narcissistic a person is, I think the more clashing will be the how would you say, your sense of opposing ideas will have more of a clashing quality, as opposed to somebody who's used to bringing alternate ideas in, at least to have perspective and understanding, which is more of a reconciliation psychology. Okay, so when I hear Jodi Hildebrandt, talking about, like, say, the battle of, like, say, truth versus darkness, or truth versus distortion, obviously I think she's interpreting her Mormon theology, and I think it's probably fair to say that the Mormons do have a theology that believes that the universe is sort of charged with a battle between good and bad, or between the light and the dark, or whatever. And I think, when you look at battle, what does battle mean? I mean, battle could be the battle to reconcile, but I think a lot of people take it to mean the battle of clashing. Okay. And so it's sort of taken in the sense of clashing, as opposed to the struggle to reconcile things. Okay. And so when I see Jodi Hildebrandt, describing, let's say, the battle of ideas, and when I see her talking about, the truth versus distortion, I see that she presents in a very intensified manner, okay, a very severe psychology of clashing, as opposed to a psychology of reconciliation. All right. And I mean, I've had this problem myself, because I've had narcissistic personality disorder, and I've struggled in my recovery. I found that a lot of the walls I have towards ideas that I don't find pleasant, or I don't find, let's say, compatible with my preferences. Okay. Almost the walls that I put up, and sort of like the screens that I put up psychologically, really do have kind of a harshness, where I really have an attitude of disapproval, and like, why would I waste my time with those ideas, kind of thing. And so, I understand what it's like to have sort of a non-reconciliatory, I guess. I don't have a very reconciliatory psychology when it comes to bringing in, let's say, incompatible subject matter, or conflicting subject matter, or subject matter that's just not in line with my preferences, basically. And I see that she has extremely intensified the sense that, the truth clashes with the distorted, you know what I mean? And that the right clashes with what's wrong, right versus wrong, light versus dark. It's like a clashing. And I think somehow she's interpreted in the Mormon theology, and in her vision of the world, that things that conflict in the world, they conflict in the sense of clashing, as opposed to having conflict, but coming into a place where they can be reconciled through understanding. Okay. So it's almost like she has sort of like dismissed, or just missed out on the opportunity to incorporate into her psychology more of a sense of reconciliation of opposing ideas, or opposing ways of thinking. Okay. So that all she's really left with is just this very clashing attitude. Okay. And when she brings her ideas and talks about who's wrong and who's right, she's bringing this clashing hostility, this super clashing hostility. And I think that's very provocative. And I think it also shows that she's allowed herself, like say, to justify a very hostile and a very militant and bellicose, a very bellicose approach to the world. Okay. And I think she feels justified because I think she feels that that is how truth sort of prevails in the universe, you know? And I think she thinks she's on the road and on the path to, like, say, more truth, because she's just going to beat down and just overcome through just raw, primitive clashing. And there's no room in that battle, in that path towards truth for, like, say, a process of reconciliation of ideas. Okay. And I think that's unfortunate. But I'm hoping that a lot of Mormons, even though they receive the same theology in their upbringing, they may have a more organic psychology of reconciliation. It doesn't mean, reconciliation doesn't mean you come to agree with everything. It just means you come to develop perspective and understanding. A classic example of this is the war in Ukraine. I am never going to say that I think, Vladimir Putin's a good person. I'm never going to say that I think Russia is a healthy country, that they have a healthy, let's say, culture or a way of looking at the world. I'm not going to ever say that the leadership of Russia isn't toxic and doesn't have a lot of problems. I'm never going to say that. Okay. And like I would never say that about North Korea. I think North Korea is one of the most unhealthy, toxic, tragic places in the whole planet. But if you're going to have, like, say, geopolitics, and you're going to try to avoid, like, major blunders where a lot of people get killed, okay, and also, like, if you want to try to avoid, like, major blunders where you set up like a reignition of the Cold War, okay, you have to be very careful how you deal with getting into the territory of superpowers that have sort of their scope of interest, just like we have in the United States a scope of interest that pretty much covers the whole hemisphere of North and South America, whether for right or for wrong. I mean, I could say I almost disagree with that, but we have that sphere of influence, okay? And so different superpowers are going to have kind of like play chess around other people's territory. Russia has their territory. Russia's territory doesn't extend all the way to Germany or France, but they do sort of have a scope of interest that sort of includes, Belarus, Ukraine, maybe some countries around, close around Russia, basically, like Georgia and countries like Kazakhstan and stuff like that. And so they do have that interest, whether for right or for wrong. And so we have to be very careful, even though we don't have to come to like Russia. We don't have to come to like Vladimir Putin. We do have to, I think, at least come to try to have reconciliation, in the sense that we take in from their point of view, that for, let's say, Russia, for a person like Vladimir Putin, a country like Ukraine is like Mexico is to the United States. Okay. And the fact is, and this is a fact, the United States would not tolerate China or Russia doing what we have been doing with Ukraine. We have been for, I think, more than a decade now, we've been sort of setting Ukraine up to have, like, expectations that are not necessarily realistic for this time in history. Okay. And we've been doing that. We've been sort of like getting involved in Ukraine and sort of nursing them to sort of develop ideas that are maybe not realistic and not compatible with, like, say, the realities of the geopolitics from Russia's point of view. You know what I mean? And it's their Mexico, basically. So we have that on our hands, and we have to wonder in the long future whether we're committing a blunder by being so stubborn and really avoiding, let's say, we could have avoided the Ukraine war before it even started, but we would have had to get on our knees and sort of retract our position with Ukraine that we've been developing. And so, in a sense, you could say the Ukraine war is the result of American stubbornness. Okay. And so when I talk about, like, say, bringing in conflicting ideas for reconciliation, okay, I'm not saying I'm going to come to a point where, oh, I like Putin now, or I think Putin's a good person, or I think Russia's a great country. No, I'm just trying to come to understanding. Okay. And that comes from taking in alternatives, ideas, and letting them sit inside you, as opposed to just clashing on them. Okay. So when I look at the United States and its recent, blunder, I feel, of allowing the war in Ukraine to actually get started, I see the same clashing stubbornness that I see in JODI Hildebrandt, where, as she faces ideas that are not to her preference, as she faces ideas that are incompatible to her view of the world, okay, um, alternative, just any alternative idea, she brings to it this idea of the clashing, like, how would you say, it's like this kind of clashing vision where I'm just going to dominate and beat you and prevail, and there's just no sense of any reconciliation in her psychology, okay. And I think that's I think even a very violent psychology, actually. And it's a very violent and very provocative psychology. And as we can see with the war in Ukraine, that kind of psychology is exactly the kind of psychology that can get a lot of people killed in the world and can also reignite a Cold War. Okay. And so, whatever. I mean, I'm not going to freak out over Jodi Hildebrand. Yeah, I find it irritating, of course, but a lot of people have this problem. This is a problem that a lot of us, even I have had. I have struggled to have more reconciliation in my own psychology. And I think my default is actually to be very clashing. Okay. So in a sense, I kind of relate to Jodi, unfortunately. But I think Jodi is kind of happy with it. Whereas in my case, I'm sort of struggling not to be so clashing, but I think Jodi, she's not only happy, I think she finds it very justified. And I think she thinks that's the path to, like, I guess the final victory of the light over the dark, or whatever. How truth is going to finally just beat down and just prevail in a clashing way over the distortion in the universe, So, I mean, that's her vision. I think it's unfortunate because I think it's a very hostile, very provocative, and I think even violent position. And so it can't really be an accident then that in the end, she's on the hook and she's being charged for really mistreating children in, I think, a pretty violent manner. Because her sense of domination that's just so inherent in her psychology, and that sense of clashing and that total lack of perspective and reconciliation. I think it just makes her a person who's just, I don't know, just her, at least psychologically, I think the dynamics of her personality and her psychology is basically that of violence, and I think, so I'm not really surprised with why she's in jail, basically, and I don't know, I guess I just like to try to just reemphasize, like, say, I don't necessarily disagree with everything that she and Ruby are thinking. A lot of their ideas and principle might have some truth to them. Okay. But because their psychology doesn't allow for more reconciliation and understanding, the way they bring their ideas to the world is just so combative and so toxic, I think, that it's just no surprise that people aren't going to be very sympathetic to their ideas, and also that in the end they're probably a lot more violent than they think they are. I think they are a lot more, let's say, they are a lot more distorted, I think, than they think they are. Okay, because they just have no reconciliation in their hearts. Okay, and so in a sense they have the distortion because there's no reconciliation. They have the distortion of no perspective. Okay. And they also have the distortion of overly catastrophizing things, as they assess reality. I think they tend to over catastrophize, typical example. I understand, in the very, I guess in the Mormon culture, and especially in the more, how would you say, the more conservative corners of the Mormon culture, I think there's this total, how would you say, there's this complete disapproval of things like masturbation and pornography, that these are just like mortal sins, like in the most catastrophic sense. Okay. It's kind of funny because, I've tried to think about these things too. I've had my own issues with, pornography, and, there was a time when I was very pro masturbation, when I thought masturbation was just one of the best things in the world, whatever. And, to be honest, as I've thought of it over time, it's not like I haven't come to, like, say, I haven't come to like a conservative position where I'm like, I think it's terrible, I think it's evil. It's not like that. But I think sometimes it's kind of almost like, how, I guess I look at masturbation on the same level as eating potato chips, basically. It's kind of the same thing. There was a time when I would have thought it's great to just eat potato chips. Hey, it relaxes me. I'm not hurting anybody. But I guess over time I've come to think, like, eating potato chips it's almost food that has almost no nutritional value. Okay, and it's sort of just pure pure pleasure. It's like smoking a cigarette, basically. And you could ask, well, what's wrong with smoking a cigarette? And I didn't say there's anything really wrong with it. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it's probably not that great either. You know what I mean? It's probably very neutral in value. You know, so if a person is like, say, masturbating, and you could even argue like, oh, but masturbating, that's how you learn your body and that's how you learn about sexuality. Okay, to some extent. Okay, fine, I understand that. But when it becomes so repetitive and it's just all the time the same thing, it's like you have to ask yourself, is it always necessary? I mean, is it so important? I mean, do we have any proof that masturbation is like this sacred activity that's so great, that's so healthy all the time? I mean, I kind of take a more neutral position on it, where I guess if I had a child that's struggling with their sexuality, I mean, I understand yeah, of course they're going to masturbate. Of course they're going to have exploration. They're going to have experimentation. But when they get so hung up on it that it's like this repetitive thing that they're always going to, like their go-to pacifier activity, there's going to be a point where, I'm not going to intervene with it, because we could maybe have a talk, like a very, not to shame them or anything, but just, I would maybe raise the idea that, when you're always having like a go-to activity where you're going to sort of pacify yourself, if that's what masturbation becomes at some point, where it is sort of like the cigarette to sort of relax you, where now you can't relax without a cigarette, basically, I'm not saying it's bad, but I'm also saying it's probably not the most mature way to deal with your frustrations and your feelings. And also, if it does become this sort of just repetitive activity, even I can see how, it's probably not like the greatest thing in the world. I'm just not going to say that. I think there's actually a lot of maturity and benefit from not masturbating, to be quite honest, but not doing it in a way where it's like masochistic or whatever, but just where you learn not to always gratify every indulgence that occurs to a person. You know what I mean? Like there has to be a point in my life where I'm not just going to gratify every whim that comes to me, because that's just part of becoming mature, and I think that's actually an achievement as an adult, and if you can see it that way, and it's not just like a masochism, oh, I'm just not going to do it just because I like the pain of it, no, just knowing that it's actually good for you as a person, good for an adult, not to indulge every whim, not to indulge everything that just occurs to you, every capricious idea, um, and I think that's part of developing maturity. Like, say, if you see good-looking people, walking around, not to like stare at them all the time. I mean, yeah, I understand the temptation, but there is something we develop as part of our maturity, that we don't have to like fall for every temptation. And if it's frustrating for us, okay, fine. I mean, that's just part of being an adult. So I can see both sides, but I'm not also catastrophizing it. You know what I mean? And so I'm just saying, like, I can almost relate to a few of their ideas. Okay. What I cannot relate to when I look at both Ruby and Jodi is how catastrophic they assess these things. Okay. How basically, and even if let's say if I had a child and I thought they were an absolute sex addict. Okay. Let's say my child is watching too much porn and maybe masturbating all the time, whatever, First of all, if I'm a parent, how am I even going to find that out, by the way? But if I did find that out, okay, and if I did think that my child was actually addicted to something, okay, even then, I'm still not going to catastrophize it, because catastrophizing a problem makes it harder to solve the problem. You know what I mean? If I really think my son, or let's say take the sex out of it, let's say I think my son has a drug problem, like he's truly addicted to drugs, even then, I'm just not going to, I don't want to catastrophize the problem. I want to understand the problem and then come up with a realistic way that he can, let's say, be motivated to work on that problem. Okay. Because if he's not even motivated and I just dominate him and just force him to deal with it, it's not coming from any place where even he is even interested, like, say, in learning about himself. So it's like there's no reconciliation in the picture. You know what I mean? I'd rather take the risk of my son maybe being in more danger, okay, but preserving his possibility to have his own reconciliation so that he can come to understand his struggle, and in that understanding and his own reconciliation, hopefully find like say the motivation to want to get better and have his own path of recovery. You know what I mean? And granted, I mean, that's more risk because, you know, you have less control over the situation. But isn't that also part of truth, that we want to learn to influence good things in the world without assuming total control? You know, I mean, and that's the other thing too. You know, I think the way that Jodi Hildebrandt looks at problems in the world is she almost looks at it. She almost looks at it through the fantasy of having total control, and not like say surrendering that you can't have always full control over a problem. Okay, um, in other words, how would you say? It's not realistic to think that your influence in the world is through total control and domination. Okay, there has to be some surrender to the risk that you're going to have to maybe try to just influence changes in the world. Okay, and that takes more maturity because that's, you know, you're having to assume, let's say, the frustration that you're not going to have your hands on the levers of every change in the world, and you have to sort of let things happen in the course of history and in the course of relationships with people, where you sort of honor their autonomy to sort of guide their own and explore through their own recoveries, you know. And so I think that when you have more of a sense of reconciliation in your heart, you're going to develop a stronger sense of other people's autonomy and the reality and the importance and nobility of allowing people, let's say, the opportunity to continue making mistakes. Okay, and that your position is more just offering them, you know, your influence, let's say, to sort of maybe help inspire them to want to find their own reconciliation. You know what I mean? But that takes more that takes more tolerance of frustration, because you're not going to just be able to control and dominate the problem, you know, and you're going to have to sort of leave people room to maybe not follow what you're suggesting, you know. And so that, I think that's the kind of that brings into me sort of a lot more uncertainty and discomfort that I'm not sure that Jodi Hildebrandt is allowing into herself. I think she's assuming more of a position of just pure dominance and control. And I think really when you look at it from far away, it's a very unfortunate and a very immature position. Okay. But instead of just trying to trash Jodi, I'm going to admit that because I've had cluster B issues in my life, you know, I struggle with this also, you know, and I have to work on my walls and my clashing psychology. And I have to work on having more reconciliation in my practice and in the way I live, you know, and also come to terms with the fact that maybe my default position and my temperament is not very conciliatory. You know, that's just, I was born that way, or I was raised that way, and I have to sort of accept it and maybe not feel so good about it, you know. But anyway, just some basic thoughts on Jodi Hildebrandt. And basically the summary of this video is just what I see in her is almost a severe sort of bias towards looking at conflict sort of through the clashing psychology. And I think that clashing sort of combative, sort of bellicose sort of approach to the world, I think is so severe in her psychology that I think it should teach all of us who have cluster B issues, you know, to look at ourselves and to see where we set up walls and attitudes about things in the world, where we also have that kind of clashing dynamic and that clashing psychological sort of substance, I would say, you know, that we may have the substance of the clashing sort of barrier to reconciliation sort of in our psychology. You know, I would suggest that comes from the amygdala. And so, you know, I think it's something that we'll see a lot with people that have antisocial and borderline and narcissistic. And I think, you know, anybody who studies psychology, I think should explore more and more how different thought patterns and attitudes arise from having maybe an overactive amygdala. And also, like, what are the techniques to sort of work on cooling it down and developing a psychology, like an adaptive psychology around having an overactive amygdala. Like, can you have an overactive amygdala and still learn, let's say, to have a broader psychology of reconciliation in spite of those fireworks? You know, I believe it's possible, but I think we'd have to develop more something along the lines of what we see in dialectical behavioral therapy, but maybe a little more tailored towards other cluster B disorders. Anyway, just food for thought. But those are just some more ideas I have about Jodi Hildebrandt. Thanks for watching.